Hello everyone. Welcome to the fourth edition of the Grain Place Foundation Seminar Series. Got an exciting episode today, but just to recap before we get into it, this series started back on March 31st with an introductory presentation describing what the project is and looking at this Reginold and Wachter paper. Continued on the 21st of April with another recorded presentation talking about the environmental and social benefits of organic agriculture, and then continued again on May 5th with a discussion of production, economics, and current issues in organic. So, with those first three episodes, now we've kind of concluded the introductory narrative arc of this series. And today I wanted to open it up for a little bit of reflection about what we've talked about so far. And to do that, I've brought in some people to help me do that. So, I'm going to give them a chance to briefly introduce themselves. And I guess we can start with Vic.
My name is Victor Bravo, senior at Kenyon College, environmental studies major, with a particular interest in agriculture.
Awesome. Yeah. We'll move on to Thomas and Ethan.
I'm also a senior here at Kenyon College, also environmental studies major, with also an interest in agriculture. I spent the last 2 years working on our student farm, the Kenyon Farm.
And then I'm Ethan Ashbrook, also a Kenyon College environmental studies senior. I have less of a focal area in agriculture and more in biology and ecology, but this has all been really interesting because of the ways that it ties in.
My name is Jared Bragg. I'm a visiting assistant professor of environmental studies and anthropology at Kenyon, and I've been working with the Grain Place for a couple of years to help them develop their internship programs, curriculum, and have been having a lot of fun collaborating with you, Isaac, on this project here.
All right. So now we'll start to get into it, but before I do, I'll just do a quick recap. So, like Jared said, this seminar series has been part of my internship at the Grain Place Farm, working remotely, where I'm trying to get a little bit of experience in kind of scientific communication as well as just looking into this interesting topic. I've been involved in agriculture since I graduated from Kenyon College as well. And using this to kind of just look at why organic has been a useful exercise for me as well. So with that said, I'll just give a quick recap of what's been said so far in the seminar series. So it's kind of been framed based off this 2016 review paper by Regnold and Wachter, titled Organic Agriculture in the 21st Century. And this was just a very broad review paper that kind of looked at the challenges, benefits, and trade-offs involved in agricultural systems. But given that that paper is almost 10 years old, I've spent the majority of the seminar series so far taking the ideas they presented, specifically the sustainability comparison, and looking about how that has changed in the last 10 years as well, and seeing if there's kind of consensus that are starting to be drawn by people in the field. So the sustainability comparison has been what I've used to frame this whole discussion, and it takes organic versus conventional agriculture and breaks it down into production, economics, social well-being, and environmental subsets of each production system. So with that said, let's look at each of those. So as Reginald and Wachter said about the environment and organic agriculture, there's this swath of benefits that they mention, and through looking at recent research, pretty much it has all pointed to the fact that there's less environmental harm from organic agriculture, with the caveat that managerial decisions do affect this as well. And organic is an ideological production mindset, but specific managerial decisions can affect exactly how any practice affects the environment. In terms of social well-being, they pointed out specifically that organic production reduces exposure to harmful chemicals and encourages diversification of production. Looking at recent research, those have both certainly been true, with additional surveys of practitioners who overwhelmingly organic practitioners report higher levels of life satisfaction, as well as the other benefits. Next, in terms of production, Rignold and Wachter pointed out organic agriculture yields about 8 to 25% lower, but this depends on crops. And looking at recent research, that has held up in every single study I've examined. Um, However, as I point out at the end of this slide here, ramping up yield is not the most pressing issue, and we can talk about that a bit more later. And then lastly, for this sustainability comparison, they looked at economics in organic versus conventional, and on average, organic is more profitable due to their increased premium prices, the demand for organic, and the lower input costs over time. Also, I pointed out some current issues that I found through my examination of recent research, specifically this idea of tragedy of the commons and externality accounting, adoption, management, and assistance in organic, the transition period to organic, label competition, certification in organic, and systemic issues in organic and agriculture broadly. So that has pretty much been the bulk of the first three videos of this seminar series and kind of what this examination has been so far. So I'd like to get into a little bit of discussion and some reflection about how the series has gone so far and if there are more questions about it. So just to start off, my first question is just one concrete thing that came away from the series that really stood out to you guys.
Yeah, so I can start. I know I mentioned to you this right before everyone got in, but I mean, it's pretty incredible, like the status quo that we need to keep growing more and more food to fit the growing population. Yet the statistics that you present show that clearly it's the mismanagement of food which is the problem. I mean, you look at it especially in the United States and like um, the obesity increase has been substantial in like the last 15-20 years, and that mainly has come down to like how much industrial farming and CAFOs have taken over. Um, and then on the flip side, like food security has like decreased immensely, especially for farmers, which is ironic, and in developing countries that continue to have high rates of hunger.
Yeah, I was going to say something similar, which was just that, like, the idea that yield is inferior in organic. And then the way you address that by talking about one, that's not necessarily true for consumers, right? Who actually very much have the potential to have their nutritional needs met. And then also not really true for producers either, because the increase in sale price sort of outweighs that loss of yield. I thought was like a really central talking point because that's something I hear when discussing organic a lot.
Yeah, a little bit left field, I guess, for me, but kind of my biggest takeaway was this idea of the transition period between conventional agriculture into like organic certification and kind of how a farmer has to like bear this burden of like I think it's like 3 to 5 years of not being certified organic, and then is able to like sell their goods on the marketplace for this like premium, but like they'd have to like eat this I don't know loss for a couple of years too, which makes I feel like the transition way more harder than like originally conceived.
Right.
Yeah, and I mean, those are all good points and things that were also kind of takeaways from me looking into this, but specifically on your point, Thomas, like that is one of the things that, for one, TOP, which the Grain Place Farm is involved in, exists to combat. But the fact that it exists is kind of reference to the fact that this is a problem. Like it does take this transition period, and it's tough economically to essentially just eat 3 years of farming organically without having any of the economic rewards. That is tough for producers, especially people who have produced in one way for so long, and this is a big change for them. I think that is definitely a big issue that continues to need to be addressed in farming and specifically organic. But I also do want to talk about what Ethan and Vic were alluding to, because this was one of the most interesting things I think from this kind of look into organic. Specifically, I've got an interest in nutrition as well, which is kind of how I got into agriculture. And on this search through, looking at papers, I found one talking about meat consumption and that we produce adequate calories to feed the world. I found that in several papers, but specifically for meat, there was one paper I found that said we even produce enough calories to feed the world in 2050 if we grow another billion people. But we allocate so much of it to feeding human edible crops to livestock, um, which is super interesting because that takes on a whole life of its own and looking at social factors, and that is largely a choice of meat consumption by a large portion of the world. A lot of people choose to eat meat, and if you look at it by the facts, it's a pretty inefficient way to eat, especially in the quantities that we currently eat on average. Yeah, that was one of my biggest takeaways as well. So we can move on. These were just a couple of my additional prominent findings that I found pretty interesting. So as we pointed out, production is clearly less. Every single paper that I looked into on organic yields found that production is less. However, I do want to point out this caveat. So currently I'm working in a master's program in agroforestry, which looks at incorporating trees and perennial crops within annual cropping regimes. And there's this idea that's come up there of over yielding. So it's the idea of when you combine two crops, both of them are going to yield less than they would alone, but the combined yield of these two things on the same area of land is actually greater. So that was another interesting thing because when we talk about yield, a lot of times it is this focused idea of looking at one crop on a large portion of land. And when you do that with the right seeds and the right fertilizer, the right pesticides, you're going to get higher yield. And no one is questioning that. But again, it's not the whole story. So, yeah, that was one of my biggest findings, as well as just organic is certainly becoming a bigger portion of the food market. And it looks like that trend is set to continue. So, what we're talking about today is only going to become more and more important. Um, Question two, this is fairly similar, but did anything surprise you guys?
I will say that there was a graph you presented in maybe I can't remember which video actually off the top of my head, sorry, comparing conventional agricultural services to organic agricultural services, and animal welfare, as we would expect in conventional, was pretty low, but it seemed like there was also a pretty high animal welfare cost in organic. And I know that's sort of a specific takeaway, but I was wondering if you could speak to that because that really surprised me because I think of organic as having like significantly higher animal welfare.
Yeah, so I think I know what you're referring to. Was it talking about externalities and showed a graph of like different production sectors of livestock versus crops?
With the horizontal bars.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Um, so I think in that one, you're talking about animal welfare. In my mind, I believe in terms of externalities, raising livestock, as we were talking about, with like feeding human edible crops to livestock, that comes with an externality because not only are you growing a crop, but then you're also harvesting it, transporting it, turning it into feed. All of those come with environmental externalities. So just on the face of it, livestock raising as a whole is going to have high externality costs, organic or not. Um, but in terms of animal welfare as well, just organic certification dictates that you do certain things for your animals. So, like you were saying, there's going to be a bit higher animal welfare rating in organic operations, but to my knowledge, you can still have somewhat CAFO resemblant organic production systems. It's not complete pasture raised, which is kind of a misconception I think people have of livestock rearing sometimes. There's ways you can work around organic certification standards. And that is something I think organic is an ideological thing at its core, and you have to set standards of how that's upheld. And of course, when you set standards, people are going to try to work around them. So that's another issue I think that is facing organic today is how do you maintain kind of the spirit of wanting to use natural processes and reinvigorate the land. And that's kind of why you've seen alternative movements, some like regenerative agriculture, for example, like that shares a lot of similarities in my mind with organic, but tries to push that a step further in dictating stricter things than organic necessarily. I hope that answered your question in a roundabout way.
I mean, just to jump in here really quick, it makes a lot of sense to me. I don't know, I don't want to speak into the details of this, but from my study of organic agriculture and the development of policy and kind of conflicts around the spirit of organic agriculture, in contrast to how the certification and the guidelines for certification have played out, particularly as organic has become itself, much more of a big business than in the origins of the organic agriculture movement in the 70s and such, when it was smaller scale, more local, countercultural, is that these rules and debates around, specifically, as you mentioned, like how you can treat animals, in some senses you can replicate. They're not really CAFO-like in the fundamental sense, but nevertheless use conditions that might not have the best outcomes for the animal welfare specifically, but nevertheless meet the certification guidelines of certified organic agriculture. And conflicts about that is, in my reading, sort of at the heart of the debate within the organic agriculture movement around the way that the certification process itself and the growth of the national and international organics market has led to what I've seen some people refer to as even a conventionalization of organic agriculture as an economic sector. So again, sort of talking in a roundabout way there, but just confirming that point, at least on my broad level of understanding, is speaking about something that's real and would maybe help explain that discrepancy that you were surprised by. I'm also just very curious about this, maybe finally dialing in this question a little bit more, thinking about your point of view as consumers. And forgive me if this is like a question that you were going to ask a little bit later, but we're thinking about like the academic side of agriculture here, but also just wondering if these readings or the presentations of the material from Isaac has changed your point of view on the value of like supporting agriculture or organic certified organic products as a consumer, and what it kind of made you think about, not only in terms of the science, but in your own purchasing choices.
Yeah, I think like one of the biggest takeaways for me in terms of like being a consumer was your point on kind of organic exports and kind of this rise in organic exports as like this domestic market can't really keep up, but also there's this niche of like fruits and vegetables that the US just can't support given like their climate, which like honestly has kind of made me consider, just like in the grocery store, like where I'm getting the food from and like where it's coming from. So I guess that.
Yeah, same thing for me. Like, definitely, like, does make me consider it more. Um, but like I mentioned this to Isaac as well. Like, I wish that there was like a clear way. Like, obviously, you can go to an organic market, but like a lot of people shop in like Walmart, and I do as well. Like, I wish there was a way that would, like, it was clear that this is like from an organic farm. And then on top of that, when you add in like greenwashing from these big corporations, it does make it difficult for there to be like a clear signal as to like, yeah, this is like truly organic versus like some fake propaganda from big corporations. But another big takeaway that I took from this was like the profitability of an organic farm versus a conventional farm. Like, it has more profits, yet the total costs are similar. And you mentioned that like 50% of the costs in a conventional farm come from fertilizer. So I was wondering how their total cost can be similar and why the profitability is more in organic.
One more time on that last question, Vic.
So like if you look at the sustainability consumption,
Yeah.
like they both are very similar in total costs, but you mentioned that in the conventional farms, like 50% of those costs come from fertilizer and like 10% from pesticides and herbicides that
Gotcha.
these guys may not use as much. So I'm wondering where these extra costs would come in from.
So, yeah, so this is actually an interesting point. Like one of the biggest cost of organic production is often labor, which can be extremely expensive. And that's another reason why, as Thomas mentioned, like this trend of increasing imports of organic produce instead of domestic production. Labor is just oftentimes cheaper in other countries, especially for farm laborers. And, there are ways in the United States that people are able to keep labor costs, artificially low, whether that be mechanization or the use of illegal immigrant workers or whatever it may be to keep those costs down. Like truly there is an undervaluing of what it costs to actually produce food. I mean, there's a lot of debate around, grocery prices in the United States, which are, rising, and it's tough to be able to afford groceries for a lot of people. But at the same time, food as a whole is kind of artificially kept so low by, subsidies and artificially low prices of these synthetic pesticides and fertilizers. But as you were mentioning, Vic, like organic farms, they still do need to use fertilizer of some sort, just because it's not the same fertilizer or pesticides. Like organic management still has to use these tools. They're just using different substances, which sometimes can be a lot more expensive, actually, in the
Hmm.
organic marketplace. So the costs ultimately, like that was something for me that was a little bit surprising, is there was a lot of disparity in what the reporting was on the actual costs of organic versus conventional. Several studies I read said it was a lot higher in organic. Several studies said it was a lot higher in conventional. Um, and so in conventional production, you're using more of these things, and that's why it can be so expensive. And you do see the yield to kind of make up for that. But ultimately, yeah, it does come out about even. But the fact is, organic receives such a higher price at the marketplace that
Hmm.
almost every single review said, like, total net wise, you're going to see greater returns in organic production.
Gotcha.
Um, this might be kind of like an ignorant point, but from my perspective, it seems like the transition to kind of a from like a conventional produce farm to a organic farm would be much easier than like an animal or kind of anything in that regard too, with the additional like costs of like organic feed and stuff. I know you're kind of talking about like how like those input costs are like much higher than in conventional systems.
Yeah, no, that is completely true. Like, organic feed is necessitated for organic livestock production, which is significantly more expensive than buying in conventional livestock inputs. So that is, I'm not an expert either on anything about livestock operations or anything, but that is certainly a huge cost of transitioning for livestock producers as well. Uh, and in terms of, other produce and stuff, it is still a transition. And again, like you're going to see maybe higher input prices. Like I've worked on several organic vegetable farms, and the fertilizers and, pesticides that we're using sometimes can be extremely expensive. Like things like neem oil, which aren't as effective as, a synthetic pesticide, um, can be extremely expensive. And so, again, this is where the kind of cost of what it actually takes to run conventional versus organic, there is disparity, and I think that's for good reason. It kind of all depends, and a lot of this is very complex and involves so many different aspects that it's not just a simple more expensive, less expensive equation.
So this third question to me is kind of simple, and I have an answer, but I want to hear from you guys. Do you think organic production, after watching, this and everything and your experience, do you think it should increase in the US?
I mean, absolutely. But it really isn't up to us. Like, once again, you got revolving door politics in the government. And so when 8 of the 25 Congress members in the USDA are receiving subsidies for their farms, they have no incentive really to um, push organic production. Rather, they are going to keep pushing more subsidies for their feed farms and stuff like that. So I definitely think that the consumer demand is helping in increasing organic production. And my hope is that it keeps going that way because I do think it should increase.
I think that it's definitely a necessity, just in the sense that there are so many strong negative externalities associated with conventional agriculture in a way that undermines like systems beside our food systems, and then also just are not sustainable in the long run for the food system itself, right? That are undermining conventional agriculture itself, that a transition will need to be made eventually, and probably the sooner the better.
Yeah, I kind of felt like I agree with you on your point, you were talking about how it's kind of like this two-prong issue of not being able to transition all at once, and it's kind of got to be this like slow gradient of transformation. I think that's probably like what we're going to end up seeing, hopefully, in the US, but I definitely do think that there needs to be kind of this increase in organic agriculture.
Yeah, so I would agree with all of you. I think organic production should increase, but I think Thomas's point too, like this is, as we've talked about, like a complex thing, and it's not as easy as just becoming organic overnight. Like there's a lot that goes into this whole process. But something I was talking with Vic about earlier, I think there is kind of this huge opportunity for agriculture in general with the phasing out of farmers of a previous generation. So that's kind of, I mean, the median age of farmers in the United States is, I believe, above 60 years old. And so in the coming 20, 30 years, we're going to see significant land changes. And so we're going to see young practitioners starting to join in, hopefully, unless all this land just becomes developed land, which would be not great. But there is kind of this huge opportunity, and that kind it leads into my fourth question of, you know, I think we all agree organic should ideally increase in the United States, but how do we get more people to adopt organic production? And this is not a straightforward answer at all, but if you guys have any ideas or things that stood out to you from the presentation that, lended themselves to convincing people to transition to organic, I'd love to hear them.
The biggest probably driver for people to transition is this like higher premium that they can get in the marketplace. You're like there is kind of I think one of your slides talks a lot about the different crops that you can grow and like how yields differ between organic and conventional, but I think like overall there is a like higher premium in the market and people would definitely respond to that. I think kind of one of the bigger problems though in trying to get people to like adopt this organic agriculture production is this idea that you brought up of kind of like social demographics in farming and how it is like disproportionately white and rather than like I think like farming should be like something for everybody, and it's like with one group kind of owning all of the land and owning all of like the arable farmland. I think it kind of changes the way that this like equitable notion is kind of pursued.
Absolutely. That was actually one of the most shocking things to me researching this is finding out like something like 98% of the land base is owned by white Americans. And additionally, there was, in a survey of producers and like only a few years ago, African American producers responded that like 60% of them had difficulty accessing capital at all, where the average was around 25%. So that is certainly, this idea like America was an agrarian republic in its, ideal formation. And this idea that, farming could be for everyone and like food, in my opinion, should be a right for people. But again, that's not necessarily the reality of what we're seeing. And that is also a difficult, very complex, problem to go about solving. But yeah, Vic, you were going to say something before.
Yeah, I'm not saying it's right, but like scare tactics. Um, like I think a lot of people either make a switch, one because of convenience, and like right now, like conventional does seem to be more convenient just because of its lower prices, or two, like a disruption. So like if someone gets some sort of like health um problem, like uh I'm not too familiar with health problems, but like that would maybe cause someone to like look at their diet and maybe look towards more organic. So like campaigns and stuff like that, because like big ag rules our food supply, and I don't think many people know that. And so like if we were to able to like gather the masses going against like one villain per se, I think people could get behind that in supporting good causes.
Well, on Vic's point of health, I mean, I think health is a valid angle to pursue, not just from the consumer perspective, but also for the producer perspective. I mean, you think about how conventional food systems expose consumers to a lot more health risks, right, in terms of like foodborne illness and the like. But also, conventional food systems expose the people on the ground to a lot more health problems as well. I mean, there's some of probably the most acute victims of the health problems associated with agriculture. And so, from a producer perspective, it makes sense that someone working in the industry would want to see a transition to organic as well.
Yeah, no, I agree. And going back to Vic's point about like scare tactics, looking at I did a talk about externalities on one of my slides in one of the presentations, and looking up externalities and how do you begin to account for these, or do any of that. I ran into some research saying that people respond significantly more quickly to negative reinforcement than positive. And in terms of externalities and how we're trying to capture those in the marketplace right now, there's a lot of programs, things like carbon accounting, or the Environmental Quality Incentive Program is one from the NRCS, which is gaining a lot of popularity. And these are fantastic programs, but they're more of a positive incentive, kind of, will help cost share to set up, a tree planting here, or, companies can offset their carbon emissions by buying back carbon that's sequestered by other people. And these are great things, but at the same time, just knowing that people respond significantly more quickly and more abruptly to a negative reinforcement, I think the idea of like a carbon tax or something of the like in organic production or agricultural production in general would be a good way to get people to adopt organic and adopt, if not even organic, more environmentally friendly farming practices. I want to hear some more from you guys just before we have to wrap up here. Just any questions that stuck out to you that remained unanswered about organic or agriculture from, the seminar series or just beyond. I mean, you guys all seem to have some interest in agriculture one way or another, so I'd love to hear about any of the questions from the seminar series or beyond.
One question I had was that you brought up that there's a pretty strong continuing trend of increasing demand for organic products in the United States. And I would love to hear what you think is behind that.
Yeah, I think it's some of what you guys have talked about in terms of health movements and people recognizing, or at least people have conceptions of what organic means. And I don't think people fully understand what it is all of the time. But I think there is certainly, I mean, as you can see by the statistics, like there is increasing demand. There's no way around that. And I don't have an exact answer for that. In my mind, I think it is, this talk about the environment and human health and how organic seems to have better outcomes for both of those. Again, I don't have a perfect answer, but that's my best guess.
Do you see there's like a way to kind of transform the organic movement into something more similar to like regenerative agriculture or something that would incorporate kind of these like closed loop feedbacks on the farm that like make these farmers like less reliant on kind of these inputs?
So I mean, that's a really interesting question and something that I think the spirit of organic, like Jared said earlier, like when it started, it had everything that like the regenerative ag movement has now. I mean, it was this ideological thing of we want to farm in tandem with nature instead of against it. And as it's gone on, people have played into like market forces and things and scaled up production and made organic kind of resemble big ag and become big organic. And I mean, I think that is truly the reason that we're seeing the emergence of these alternative production system things like regenerative, for example. And so, in terms of remedying that, I think there are several ways to go about it. I mean, despite how some corporations are now taking organic and modeling it after conventional agriculture, that's still getting, the benefits of organic in some ways. It's not a perfect system, but in terms of we're talking about a slow, gradual transition. we still need big producers. We have a large population, and big organic, I think, is going to be part of the future. But I think, these alternative movements, like you were talking about, regenerative, have kind of taken the place of this ideological stance that organic was on, and how that plays out. I'm not exactly sure. I am interested to see, but yeah, so that was, I mean, some of the stuff I skipped over in those last slides was from my own master's course this last week. We read a paper about integrated crop and livestock systems. So this used to be almost every farm was an integrated crop and livestock system. However, with the forces of, capitalism and scaling production, they've become either spatially or temporally separated, which again, in that paper that I was talking about that we read for my master's course, it essentially was saying you need a large market disruption and you need grassroots movements. So you need large disruptive policies, not policies that kind of play into the status quo, but you need a real disruption of the current political and economic scene as well as grassroots movements. So I don't think I'm answering your question at all, but I'm kind of just talking out my thoughts.
I think the point that I'm thinking of that, I'm like hearing the Grain Place board member or president now, Dave Meyer, his go-to saying is always organic is regenerative. And I think remembering that there's not just organic agriculture, but there are operations like the Grain Place farm that are, technically they have the organic certification, but then there's the add-on organic regenerative certification that accounts for other principles and practices of the management system that go beyond the requirements of just what it takes to be certified organic at the national level. And, therefore, I think that there's some questions, and it's like an interesting, almost like social scientific or like cultural narrative question around why is it, for example, I think that like regenerative agriculture has these connotations of being somewhat more in tune with like ecological principles when many people who practice regenerative agriculture do so because they like, for example, rely on spraying a lot of pesticides as part of their own management systems. So, maybe they're not tilling and they're, doing these other kind of directly, soil health management practices, but they do other things that perhaps with time we will come to appreciate have, negative ecological consequences themselves. So I think that, looking for these questions about models and thinking about the future of organic food in general in the United States, looking at places like the Grain Place that have pursued, not just the bare minimum in terms of their organic certification and their commitment to these principles and ideals, but really push the envelope in terms of, being a farm that does not, for example, require any outside inputs in terms of synthetic, even organic pesticides or fertilizers because they have committed to this very ecologically based long-term rotation that includes the use of animals for several years in their cropping system, meaning that they don't have to use like, organic trailer washouts or something like that. So remembering that both of these terms are kind of like big containers and that there's like often a gap between the technical kind of legal regulatory definition of these terms and then the scientific philosophical words that we use like regenerative or organic to capture maybe some of our more holistic sentiments about these ideas.
I definitely agree with all of that. And yeah, it does kind of seem like in a way organic is moving towards just encapsulating that, regulatory legal framework, whereas these other terms like regenerative or whatever it may be are kind of capturing now the ideological sentiments involved with
Maybe
these
that has
production systems.
something to do. I noticed at your beginning on your list of additional topics, you had mentioned like one of them was like competition between organic labels and certifiers. And I think that issue maybe touches on some of these fine distinctions that that we're discussing now. Is even within organic agriculture, it's an ecosystem unto itself where people have varying kind of levels or of adherence to some of these ideas and are advocating for different sets of principles even within that one term or concept.
Yeah. Yeah. So now I want to move on just to my last question, which we've kind of already answered and touched on. But any knowledge gaps that you guys noticed from my seminar series or that wasn't touched on in my seminar series that are remaining?
I've got one more question for you, and sorry, I'm not really. I feel like I'm feeding you hard questions today. Uh, but you mentioned in one of your vids that organic tends to use up something like 64% more land. I don't know how that was adjusted, like if that was like per yield or per what metric that is exactly. But I was thinking that does seem like a pretty significant increase in land use or decrease in land intensity. And if we're sort of wanting to, and we are wanting to make this transition in the United States away from conventional and towards organic, that seems like that would incur sort of a high land cost, which seems troubling because I feel like right now most of the conversations I hear around land use and agriculture are more along the lines of intensifying our agriculture or shrinking our agricultural footprint, especially because agricultural land is in competition right now with so many other forms of land use like solar farms or setting land aside for things like pollinators or land in the conservation reserve program, right?
Yeah, so that's a really great question actually, and this is something that as I was also a biology major interested in ecology, and there's this big ecological debate of land sharing versus land sparing, which I think plays perfectly into what you're talking about. And I don't remember the specific statistic about land use under organic, but it is a pretty high consensus given the lesser yields. To reach those same yields using organic production, you need more land. But in terms of the land sharing versus land sparing, another debate that I had recently in my master's course and read a paper on, many scholars in that area now are saying it's not really a this or that, it's a both and. So for example, like what my master's degree is in is agroforestry, so that's like the land sharing debate where you're bringing in these environmental aspects into agricultural land, such as trees, which, do a swath of things for the landscape, like its wildlife corridors, does things for the soil as well. But there's also the idea of land sparing, where you really intensify agriculture for the idea of putting it in a small sector of land and then leave a ton of land untouched. So these are two disparate, ideologies, and I think it really is this both and. This is such a complex issue, land use and exactly how we're going to use land to feed our entire population, that it really is kind of a both and scenario. It's not one or the other. And that's kind of frustratingly is the answer for almost all of these questions. It's kind of it depends and it's a gradient.
Yeah, but I
So
mean, it depends. Good answer. Like I appreciated at the end of maybe your first video. I can't remember if it was maybe your first or second, but you put a really heavy emphasis on the transition being explicitly long run and very explicitly producer individualized, which I think makes sense because I feel like that acknowledges a lot of the pitfalls of other modes of change, maybe. And like I think that's like a more realistic approach.
yeah, and so that actually leads into my conclusion again. Kind of like I was just saying, like our current system, it does have a lot of problems, but like you were saying, it takes time to transition these. One of my professors used to talk to me about how recycling when he was growing up wasn't a thing at all. And it kind of started to come around, and he was like, oh, within 5 years, this is going to be everywhere. And it took like 40 years for it to become more mainstream and established. Like that's another relevant example of how, things take time and change is gradual. And that's not something to get frustrated by, but rather to understand and accept. And again, organic has a lot of problems too, but it also has a lot of benefits, as we've seen from this series. Um, so for me, that seems like a good place to wrap it up, unless you guys have any more things you want to talk about, questions, anything? No? All right. Well, thank you all again, and I wish you the best on the rest of your finals week.